All right, good afternoon and welcome to our South Carolina Ag Disruptors webinar. We've had the webinar going for several months now, and this is our July edition. So again, we do it the third Wednesday of every month and have various topics and various speakers, but always try to touch on something that could have a significant impact on South Carolina agriculture. So we appreciate you logging in and joining us for today. The other thing we would say is if you think of or know of some topics that you would like to hear about or would like to hear from certain speakers, you can certainly let us know that. We've kind of got our schedule planned out for the next couple months, but we've got a couple open spots later this year. So again, if there are some topics that you think are emerging or would be interesting to hear about, please let us know about that. But I'm Kevin Burkett with the Clemson Extension Agribusiness team. We've got several speakers for today. We've got Dr. Nathan Smith. He's going to touch on the carbon market and carbon credits in agriculture. We've got Dr. Marzieh Motallebi, who is going to touch on carbon markets for forestry. And Dr. Lucas Kay, who's a PhD student, is going to touch on carbon markets and forestry. And Dr. Steve Richards is going to touch on evaluating another business idea for this month. So real quickly, we'll do a poll question. We just kind of like to ask these before we get started, just to see kind of what your level of knowledge is surrounding these topics. So you should see a poll question pop up on your screen. It just says, what is your level of knowledge on carbon markets in agriculture? You can just indicate there what your knowledge is. Give people just a little bit to respond. All right, looks like everybody has responded. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Smith and we'll get started in just a second.
All right, thank you, Kevin, and good afternoon, everybody. It's good to be with you. And as Kevin mentioned, actually today's topic came from a question in the field, also a question about carbon credits. What are they in ag? And we've also, as Kevin introduced, Marzieh and Lucas invited, since most farms and will have some type of typically have some timber or it may involve forestry. We've invited experts in that field too to cover the ag and forestry as far as carbon markets. So I'm going to start us off today and talking just a kind of a little policy overview, a little bit about carbon markets, carbon credits, and just touch on contracts a little bit. And let's see. All right, so before I get into the presentation itself, I want to acknowledge that I have slides and information. I'm not the expert in this topic, but have tried to learn and research it. On the policy side, I have some slides from Dr. Joe Outlaw at Texas A&M, and then Dr. Eric Edwards, who works more in the environmental area, made a presentation a while back that he was nice enough to share the slides also, and acknowledge Trey Buckaloo, who helped me in putting together some of these slides and examples. So when we're talking about carbon credits, that's nothing new. They've been around a while, but the more recent policy changes came with the new administration. And President Biden announced April in 2021 new targets for greenhouse gas pollution reduction. And this target aims at 50 to 52% reduction in greenhouse gas pollution from the U.S. Benchmarked against 2005. And that target is to reach that level by 2030. It also sets a U.S. goal of trying to reach to reach net zero emissions economy-wide no later than 2050. And so these are the priorities in climate policy. There's a National Climate Task Force that was formed with the new administration that includes most of the cabinet level leaders, including USDA, Department of Agriculture, working towards these goals and also trying to reach 100% carbon pollution-free electricity by 2035, and delivering 40% of the benefits from federal investments. In other words, the spending and whatnot from the federal government on clean energy and climate to disadvantaged communities. When we look at what I guess emissions, greenhouse gas emissions and sinks by economic sector in the U.S., this is just a pie chart showing it's about 25% industry, 25% electricity, and transportation each, kind of a little different in each one, transportation a little more, and then 13% commercial and residential, and then 11% is attributed to agriculture. And so agriculture has a role, I guess, in climate policy, and that's why we're, I guess, talking about carbon credits today. So carbon credits in agriculture, as I mentioned, the climate policy is top priority of the Biden-Harris administration. There's really two main methods for reducing emissions. You can either regulate it or have voluntary programs. In some states and in some sectors, it's required to reduce greenhouse gas emissions or CO2 emissions. Agriculture, like shown in the previous slide, has potential to reduce carbon emissions through some less intensive practices when it comes to tillage or soil farming, using soil and resources, and also has the potential to capture and store carbon via partial and full land conversion. Currently we're seeing voluntary markets and government programs that are being developed towards these goals. I mentioned about the two choices, whether you can regulate it or have a voluntary program. These are pretty much, this is a chart from Dr. Outlaw looking at the approaches where we have, if folks who farm know about a lot of the NRCS programs or programs that are in the Farm Bill, where it's a cost share or pay to adopt practices. These would be direct payments to farmers or folks who are eligible, like Conservation Reserve Program, EQIP, Conservation Security Program, those type programs. More recently, they're starting to look at carbon banking, where you're paid to accumulate carbon through your practices. And I guess right now it's kind of being developed in both sides, the industry side or private market and government, in terms of looking how a carbon bank might look like. The other side, which has been in policy for a while, we've had proposals and legislation proposed for cap and trade, regulating emissions. That's done now in certain sectors, and then carbon taxes, where you get a reduction in carbon emissions by taxing and paying to encourage the reduction in those. As far as climate policy, I mentioned USDA earlier, so the Department of Agriculture came out in the transition with a memo, and I just highlight or circled, I know this probably can't read it with the small print, but basically the recommendations coming out of this Climate 21 memo was that climate change, to signal that climate change is a top priority of the USDA. And it's also looking at investigating the establishment of a carbon bank and incentivizing climate smart agriculture is the term. I view the climate smart as just a different nomenclature for conservation practices that we've had programs for in effect now and previously. But including those incentives in crop insurance and rural development grants, loans, and USDA procurement, and as well as decarbonize rural energy and to promote green energy in the rural areas. So this is just a chart that Joe Outlaw shared showing greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. And back in 2020, it's estimated we were at 17% below from 2005. So we've been trending in the U.S. down in terms of greenhouse emissions. And the goal now was in 2025 to be 26. If we continue that trend, recent trend would be 26 to 28% below in 2025. And the goal is to get to 50% or more by 2030. So since those priorities were announced in summer of last year, June of 2021, the Growing Climate Solutions Act was passed that directs USDA to establish a certification program that would provide for private industries that provide technical assistance to farmers, ranchers, and foresters who participate voluntarily in the carbon credit markets or to trade carbon credits. And following that law, Secretary Vilsack sent out a request for information in late September with the purpose of basically how to establish this program. What are the recommendations on what it would look like and how it would work? Well, after the comments came in, the Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities grant came out. And Clemson University and South Carolina State University put together a proposal. We've applied for this grant. There's $1 billion in funding for new pilot programs. Basically, those 3 bullets that the grant is required to implement climate smart production practices and activities and systems on working lands, and also to do pilot projects on measuring and quantifying or monitoring the greenhouse gas benefits. And this is all with the goal of developing markets and basically the certification program to help measure, because we do it on a small scale in research, but individually and on farms, that's a whole different ball game and much more difficult to measure. So the challenges that I'm kind of mentioning with climate policy is measurement. That's what that grant program is designed to target at, and volatility, where you implement some practices to sequester carbon. They can be reversed. They're reversible. Markets change, and in the market, in the short run, the market may encourage more to move away from some of those practices to meet demand. Additionality, that's one of the big challenges, in that the focus is trying to bring in or folks to adopt that haven't adopted yet. So basically, it's looking at adding to what's already being done in terms of reducing greenhouse gases and emissions and sequester carbon. And then regional equity, one size doesn't fit all. In other words, amount of carbon you might sequester or the carbon credit would be different regionally. Existing programs that are in this area are mentioned earlier. CRP, that's expanding. Conservation Stewardship Program, the equipment program, which is environmental quality incentives, that's authorized to increase by $2 billion, or to $2 billion, I'm sorry, for fiscal year 2023. The Agricultural Conservation Easement Program increases funding by $450 million, and then the Regional Conservation Partnership Program increasing funding by $300 million. And so these programs are being, funding is being increased to encourage the climate smart practices. So I've talked a good bit about the overview of the policy situation and kind of where carbon credits come in, are coming into the picture in agriculture. So what are carbon credits? That's basically a term used for either, it's traditionally been a permit, but I think more now what we're talking about is a tradable certificate in a voluntary market that gives the right to emit a certain amount of CO2 or equivalent amount of greenhouse gases. It's basically talking about a carbon offset market where someone buys a credit from somebody who reduces their emissions, and they get credit for it if they're a heavy emitter. They can reduce their quote impact by buying credit from somebody else who will reduce their emissions. A single credit is generally equals 1 ton of carbon dioxide or an equivalent other greenhouse gases, and companies can purchase these credits and hold them, or even if they got more, purchase excess, sell them. So carbon offset is, I guess here's just a picture where a firm wants to reduce emissions, and they're doing it through either required or voluntary method. And to reduce their emissions, they may not be able to do it quickly, but they may have a long-term strategy, but in the short run, they'll reduce it by paying somebody else and to offset some carbon emissions or greenhouse gases through the different methods or practices that qualify or work. And that payment for offset is considered a win-win. It costs less than doing it through taxes or regulatory side or whatnot. It's considered an efficient way to do it. As far as the counting with carbon credits, the big thing, basically all the contracts are looking for additionality. They're looking for greenhouse gas reductions that would not have occurred before selling the offset credit. And this is one area that's challenging in terms of how do you determine who's the additionality, and also can it be manipulated out in the field. So, currently they're looking at areas that are low in adoption or have not used the practice prior and consider them eligible. Certification is the other part of accounting, where you certify, or you may have an audit on the farm, or where you have sold credits, where they can come on and do soil testing to figure out what payments be, or to see what is there, and modeling. There's models that try to estimate the sink or the carbon sequestered or the emissions that are happened or saved. And there's a lot of questions, and it's just a developing market, basically. So there's a lot of potential practices for carbon credits: decreasing fertilizer usage, using alternative types of manure management, reduce fuel consumption, conversion of land from production or cultivation, afforestation. As far as ag and agriculture, the most common or the current payments that we're looking at today is really just tied to tillage and cover crops. That's what's mostly being purchased is carbon credits for switching to reduced or no-till and implementing cover crops. So, this is what's being done now is a voluntary carbon market, and it's an offset market. I don't know if I mentioned earlier, but you can do the carbon tax. That's another market, and the cap and trade. Which cap and trade's been around for a while, and there's a lot of examples in the U.S. and worldwide of either voluntary or mandatory cap and trade. They trade a little bit higher because they are capped, and so I think $30, maybe $35, $25 to $35 would be more of an average, but there is a pretty wide range per ton or per carbon credit. And a price is basically determined just like selling a commodity when a transaction happens. Right now, like I said, the only game in town for carbon credit offset market is voluntary. Mentioned earlier, USDA is looking at a carbon bank and don't really know where that is. Carbon credits are probably around $10 to $15 per ton of CO2 equivalent right now. And typically they're long-term contracts, 10 years or more. Dr. Edwards provided this chart that shows different types of reduction practices, of carbon reduction practices, and this is more of a dated study, but right there in the break-even price column shows what the dollars per carbon credit, ton of carbon credit, what the break-even prices were in switching to those practices or implementing those practices. Right now, probably the one for reduced fertilizer application is probably the most viable in terms of trying to meet those break-evens and what the market's doing or offering. But on the right side, you see kind of what the potential is. Agriculture certainly has potential, but then there's a lot higher carbon reduced emissions on some of the more restoring wetlands or retiring land as far as how much carbon you save or reduce emissions. So carbon contracts, when we start talking about carbon credits, Rusty Rumley with the National Ag Law Center was able to acquire copies of different carbon contracts. And these contracts are confidential, and so we don't have access to them. I haven't seen a contract. So I'm just relying on what he reported. He gave a presentation and also did a little, this is coming out of his article in Southern Ag Today from January 28th of 2022. But basically, he described them. What the contracts that he looked at were basically reduced till, no-till farming, planting cover crops, and foregoing harvesting of mature timber. They generally had a confidentiality clause as far as the contract goes. He identified some elements that landowners should be aware of before signing the contract. They ranged from 1 to 10 years with an opportunity to extend longer. There was one contract that actually required 100 years of storage of carbon. There's a commitment to comply with the contract for the entire life of the agreement. So there could be, penalties for breaking the contract. And the landowner often has to grant the other party access to the property to take carbon sequestration measures. Payments and payment mechanisms can vary substantially. Some pay for certain practices, such as $3 per acre for no-till farming. Some pay based on the tons that are sequestered, which could typically be around $15 to $20 per ton as a payment rate. But is that for a quarter of a carbon credit or half of a carbon credit? If it's a half, then you're looking at $17.50 to $10 per acre. Method of carbon measure can vary and some really not explicit in terms of how they will measure. There's a lot of definitions that may mean something different than when you read the word, so they recommended paying careful attention to the definitions in the contract. And one of the things I guess was maybe a surprise. I don't know if this is a surprise, but wasn't thinking that we're talking about carbon and greenhouse gases, but some contracts may include transferring other environmental benefits, allowing the other party to sell off not just your carbon credit, but other credits, like water quality credits. Does the carbon contract have a mechanization to enable the landowner to realize any gain from sale or other environmental benefits? And you need to review the language that allows you to profit from that, so that you understand whether you can profit from other potential environmental benefits, or you're selling them all just for the carbon credit. There's several different companies, and I know you can't read this, but this is just showing how they do vary. You got different check marks on different types of models of the companies that are involved in carbon credits. Indigo, Nori, ESMC, Agoro, Bayer, Corteva, Gradable, and SIBO are different avenues or different companies that are in the carbon credit market. And you can look at these up online. For example, you can go to Indigo, which is basically a broker of carbon credits, and see how it works. You'd have to sign up. It's just more of an example or what's their webpage looks like, and giving you an idea. $15 per carbon credit, potential gross 30 plus for up to 2 credits per acre. Bayer, I think they're closed right now, but has a program where they were paying per practice, like was mentioned earlier, $3 per acre per year for no-till, strip till, $6 for cover crops, or $9 for both. We were going to try to put Sandhill Rec enter into and see what would come out if we signed up for a contract, but that wasn't able to do that. But we did enter Richland County. Say we're doing conventional till. This is the Corteva Carbon Initiative example. Currently doing conventional till, and we switch to no-till and start planting a multi-species containing legumes, a cover crop, then it's estimated that we would have 0.69 carbon credits per year, earning $13.80 per acre per year by switching our practices from conventional to no-till and introducing multi-species cover crop with a legume. And so that's just an example. We were kind of curious whether that's different, how it looks for different states. So we looked at Georgia, North Carolina, and then some just random. There's no rhyme or reason why I picked these states, but just chose different places. I thought that we would go in from conventional to no-till and multi-species legume, which is really your top, where the maximum, where you're probably going to get your max payment by switching to these practices here. I thought we would be kind of low on carbon credit, but South Carolina comes out at 0.69 at 1380, and right now it's just a state estimate because we've tried different counties and they all came up the same. Georgia was a little bit less, 0.64 per tons per acre, and North Carolina was the same in this example as us. Arkansas was actually higher at 0.89. And then Illinois, Iowa, it ranged from 0.44 in Michigan to a high of 0.89 in Arkansas in terms of carbon credits by switching to these practices. If we did the non-legume cover crop, that lowered the payment by about $5 in South Carolina. And actually, it was a little bit, you saw a little difference between North Carolina and South Carolina in this example. North Carolina was a little bit higher on the carbon credit ton. So those are just, an example. I'm going to end here. Will carbon credits work for you? It's obviously a market that's developing. It is voluntary. So you don't have to think of it as an all or nothing proposition. Obviously, the policy direction is supporting climate smart agriculture and development of these markets. Could carbon credits help offset production costs? Potentially. I guess my opinion right now is for a long-term contract, you saw some of those break-even prices. I'm not sure price is high enough for me to do a long-term, so maybe looking at doing part of the farm or one of your smaller farms to learn or to get involved, if that's something you really want to try out or want to try to look at adding some cash opportunities, cash payments. Maybe not go the whole farm, but also have your contract reviewed by a lawyer, particularly related to the rights being sold. So, is now the time to go all in? I'm not, myself and my colleagues are not really excited about jumping all in right now because we think the market is in the development phase and prices are probably not high enough to go all in, but not saying that it's not something definitely worth investigating on the agriculture side. So with that, I'm going to stop here and switch over to Marzieh. And if Marzieh's on, do I need to give her, if she's ready, I will stop sharing and she can load up her presentation.
Kevin, could you please give me permission to share my screen?
Yeah, Marzieh, you should have it now.
Okay. Perfect. So can you see it?
Yeah, we see the slideshow. It's not in presentation mode yet, but I see the slideshow.
Okay, let me try it again. How about now?
Yeah, I think if you go to slideshow
Yeah, I did it.
and then from beginning.
I pressed that one.
There you go.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for having me and Lucas. My name is Marzieh Motallebi. I am stationed at the Baruch Institute of Coastal Ecology and Forest Science. And today, Lucas and I will be talking about Forest Carbon Market 101. Basically, we are going to touch the basics of what carbon credits are and how landowners can take advantage of this ecosystem service that is provided in their land. So I turn off my camera now, and then during Q&A, I will come back. So. Okay. As you know, forests provide a wide range of ecosystem services. Forests can clean the air, filter water, help with mitigating flooding and erosion, sustain biodiversity, and provide many opportunities for recreation. In this presentation, we are mainly focusing on the role of forests in cleaning the air and helping us with combating climate change. 2 years ago in 2020, an inventory of the United States greenhouse gas emission provided by EPA Environmental Protection Agency showed that forested areas are acting like a sink, and they increase carbon stock, they sequester carbon, and based on this report, forestry sector represent an offset of approximately 13.6% of total greenhouse gas emissions, which is huge. Forests are doing their job. They are providing this big ecosystem service to us, and forest landowners who own a piece of land, forest land, should take advantage of this ecosystem service. Forest landowners can generate credits by changing their management practices. What I mean by changing their management practices, they have to switch to one of these three mentioned management in this slide, including improved forest management, avoided conversion, and reforestation. If they follow these practices, they switch to these practices, they will sequester more carbon, and that carbon, sequestered carbon, will be translated in a form of credit. Then the credits can be sold to industry or a company that is required to lower their greenhouse gas emission. As Nathan mentioned, what we mean by a credit is 1 ton of CO2 equivalent equals 1 carbon credit. So in this picture, I tried to show a very simplistic view of how we can measure credits, how we can show how much credit we have. So as I mentioned, if landowners change their business as usual practices via one of those three mentioned management practices, they can sequester carbon over time. Figure two shows that a landowner, by changing their practice, their business as usual practice, to, for example, improve forest management practice, create a gap. This gap that shows here in this figure shows the amount of credit that are given for for carbon sequestration over a period of time. Carbon credits needs to pass through 3 tests for us to call them a valid credit. The first test is additionality, and Nathan touched additionality in AgLang. We define additionalities here that additionality requires that the forest project sequester more carbon than in a business as usual scenario, and project must show that carbon sequestration would not have happened without the development of a specific offset project. Additionality is big and is very challenging, but credits should pass the first test to go to the next one for us to call them a valid credit. The second test is permanency. Permanence requires that greenhouse gas emission removal to be maintained for a long period of time. For example, in case of California carbon market, they were required that these credits remain for 100 years. And the last test, but not the least, is non-leakage. Leakage for carbon projects happens when greenhouse gas reduction in one area cause in an unintended increase in greenhouse gas emission in another location. Leakage is one of the biggest concern in afforestation projects, and landowners should show they don't have leakage in another location under their name. When we talk about carbon marketplace, we need to make ourselves familiar with three big words. The first one is the definition of a carbon market. Nathan touched on that part too. We have two types of carbon markets. The first one is compliance market. Compliance markets created by the need to comply a regulation, a regulatory act, and we normally call them cap and trade programs. These days, when we talk about carbon markets, we normally talk about voluntary situation. Voluntary markets happens and exist where companies or individuals buy carbon credit for voluntary reason. For example, they have some sort of social responsibility. They have some commitment to protect the environment. So after we know which type of market we are talking about, the second big word that we need to talk and know about is carbon registries. Carbon offset projects are usually registered, traced, and tracked by independent registries such as American Carbon Registry, such as Vera, Climate Registry. And these independent parties can lead protocols, they can design protocols, they can design methodologies to rule the accounting calculation for measuring carbon credits. And also these registries define how we are going to monitor, how we are going to report how much credit we are generating from a land. Verification and certification should be issued by registries. It is very crucial for us to understand the difference between registries to select which measurement and certification and verification is good for our project. Sometimes a carbon project that is viable under one registry protocol might not be viable under another registry protocol. So it's very important to choose the right registry for your land. The last word that we need to make ourselves familiar with is carbon developers. Carbon developers are, excuse me, several groups that work with landowners in developing carbon projects and to ensure that a credit is eligible to be sold to a buyer. Landowners always need to submit a detailed items, including the type of their project, location of their land, the ownership of their land, the plan for future, the forest type, etc., to a carbon developer. And then a carbon developer come to the land, work with the landowner in various stages to design a carbon project and installation, a carbon inventory on the forest land owner land. We have different developers in the US, including Blue Source, Finite Carbon, TNC, the Nature Conservancy, Natural Capital Exchange, etc. As I mentioned, carbon credits and carbon markets can provide a new or additional revenue for forest landowners, especially for non-industrial private forest landowners. Forest landowners that have lower opportunity costs, for example, they have lower value of timber or their harvest cost is quite high, so they can take advantage of selling their sequestered carbon through carbon market. Or forest landowners that are planning to have a longer hold on their land and not harvest the trees for timber for a longer period of time. When landowners follow carbon-oriented forest management practices, they actually are benefiting us as a society in different ways. They create co-benefits. For example, they are enhancing wildlife habitats, improve water quality, improve soil quality, and they're conserving biodiversity, which is nice. And carbon-oriented management practices have shown that we have other co-benefits, other ecosystem services in their land after following carbon credit protocols. The biggest question is, now we know what the credits are and how we can reach out to a carbon developer. So where we start? So when we reach out to a carbon developer as a landowner, we need to sign a contract and commit to generate credits for a specific period of time. Landowners need to obtain a current forest inventory by professional foresters. As I mentioned, they have to list the forest type, size of their land, the tree species, the ownership, the future plan. All of these items should be submitted to a professional forester. And then they have to promise that they are going to follow a management practice that sequesters carbon above their business as usual carbon stock. This is very important. This is the gap that I showed in figure 2 that creates credit for you. And in some protocols, not every protocol, some protocols, they require certification. For example, they require landowners to get certification such as sustainable forestry initiatives or SFI. And also landowners need to keep a written record of ongoing management practices in their land. And they need to be aware the process of verification and monitoring happens periodically, is going to happen periodically in their land, depending on the protocol, every year or every other year, or somewhere between 1 to 6 years, they have to go through the process of reporting and monitoring and whatnot. So, and also some protocols, for example, California carbon market required a conservation easement on the land. This carbon, as I mentioned, can create revenue, additional revenue, but at the same time, it comes with uncertainties for landowners. We always receive these questions, and what are the risks? And there are risks. Every decision we make in our life has risks. And the risk for forest landowners to switch to practices that create credits can be involving with the changing prices of the credits. And as we know, price of each credit can change if, for example, supply or demand change. If we have new offset projects, if the regulation change, the demand might change. And all these changes can impact the price of each credit. Also, long-term commitment is something that you promise you have to follow this practice over a long period of time. And long-term commitments can be risky and scary. And also the process of constant being monitored and going to the process of verification is another commitment and can cause uncertain situation for forest landowners. Also, there's a big issue for smaller landowners because the cost of entering the market is quite high for smaller landowners. And also transaction costs can be an issue, cost of finding the best way to register your land, finding the best market for, price for your credit, cost of writing and enforcing the contracts can cause issues for landowners. So after this, I will turn to Lucas and I will advance your slides, Lucas.
All right, thank you so much, Marzieh. Appreciate it. So basically, I'm just going to give a little bit more of an overview of some of these principles, because these principles are really crucial to making sure that we have robust, and we're creating robust carbon credits on the ground. So we talked about additionality, permanence, and making sure they're verifiable. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail how those practical applications actually apply, but then also real and no double counting, also important parameters for credits. So when we consider a real credit, this is just the basic idea that we're making sure that scientific backing is how we're measuring the carbon on the ground. So are we using peer-reviewed literature and scientific standards to measure this carbon? Furthermore, when it comes to no double counting, this is the part where the credits are being traded in the market. So are the credits being counted for multiple entities? So there's no transparency when it comes to the trading of credits once they're sold on the market. So increased transparency will help with no double counting. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So again, additionality is this idea that you must be doing something on your land that is different than business as usual. So again, this is doing a management practice that's going to increase carbon on the landscape, but also the payments from the carbon credits must provide financial incentive to do this new management. So the payments that you are receiving is going to incentivize you to change your management practices. So if you look at the schematic here, on the top image, we have an agriculture system. And if we move to a forestry system, this is actually true additionality. We've added carbon on the landscape. The second image there, we have agriculture and forestry, but then we change to forestry and agriculture. So we may have changed our management here, but we actually didn't change the amount of carbon on the landscape. This is not true additionality. And then on the last image there, we have two sections of forestry, and then one of them moves to agriculture. This is actually a loss of carbon on the landscape. Again, this is no additionality. Okay, next slide. So we talked about permanence as well. Permanence is retaining carbon on the landscape, ideally forever. But when it comes to carbon market protocols, 100 years has been this decided on factor. And a lot of protocols have 100-year timeframes for their projects. But when it comes to actually practicality of implementing that for landowners, other projects have gone between 20 and 40 years and some as short as 1 year. So using mathematical calculations to determine permanence, we can have those shorter projects. And so there's other things like 10-year accounting that accounts for that. And also easements. Easements are what actually create that permanence to reduce the risk of loss of forest. Also, so buffer pools, Marzieh briefly mentioned this, where we account for unavoidable reversers. So fire, severe weather, avoidable reversals elsewhere and other projects. And this is typically between 2 to 29% of the verified carbon credits on the property. So if you go forward one, Marzieh. So for instance, if this image here, if it's this blue area is your entire carbon project, the green area is going to be that buffer pool that's already verified carbon, but cannot be part of your selling credits. Next slide. The last major tenet is verification. So again, verification is extremely important to make sure that the carbon that we are modeling is actually the carbon that's on the ground. And there's a couple ways to do this. Many of the protocols use the common practice baseline, as you see there on the left. You have an eco region throughout the United States, and each of those regions have a common practice value of carbon. And then you measure and you see if your carbon value is above or below that common practice value. But a more stringent verification process is a comparison plot baseline. So if you move forward one or two there, Marzieh. So here you'll see, for example, if this is a carbon project, on the left side of the dotted line, you'll see this is a carbon project. The right side is not a carbon project. What we would do is select two plots, one with, and both of these plots are going to have forest types and structure that are very similar. And then we would compare the carbon over time on each of these plots, and then we'd be able to see the additional carbon based on that new management practice. Okay, next. So some basic tenets of improved forest management, and you can read this here, but briefly, some of these basic practices that are used are increasing rotation ages, thinning and diseased and suppressed trees, maintaining stocks at a high level. All of these practices, again, must be implemented in the context of additionality, so the funding from a carbon project would help with the management or help with this improved forest management. Okay, next. So here's an idea of how we actually create the additionality. So the first thing we would do is determine the management that works for your land. Then we enter into the contract with one of the protocols, and then we would do carbon management in addition to or in place of timber management. So in this case, if you see, this blue line is the increase in timber yields over time in terms of carbon dioxide equivalents. And if you go forward one, Marzieh. But if you were to implement a carbon project midway through the cycle, you would have to do that additional project to measure carbon over time. So the yellow arrow shows the additional carbon on the landscape due to the project, and that is the carbon that can be sold in the carbon market. Next slide. And then we've kind of talked about this from an ag perspective, but also from a forestry perspective. There are a variety of different protocols and different project developers, as Marzieh mentioned, that you can choose to implement these projects. As you can see there, from the management perspective, some of the major management practices are improved forest management, reforestation, or avoided conversion, and they have variable areas that can be implemented in these projects based on the verification costs, and also variable time lengths. Some of the projects would be between 40 and 100 years. Some would be a maximum of 40, or some would even be as short as 1 to 5 years. Okay, next. Last but not least, just a little bit more on the pathway to generating credits. So a lot of it has to do with the feasibility analysis. That has to be the first part. The project developer would cruise the forest and determine those protocols to follow. And then ultimately, they would be able to list the project on a registry eventually, and project the future sequestration. So then a third party would actually have to come in and verify. There would be a desk verification, but also an on-the-ground verification. These are sometimes where these costs can increase over time. And then a registry review. So this is where the actual verifier and the person that would issue the credits verifies the project, and then those people can ultimately issue those credits. So that's like Vera is a nonprofit, along with Climate Action Reserve or the American Carbon Registry. These are the people that would actually issue the credits to be sold on the market. And next slide. So that'll be it from me on the principles. But if you have additional questions about carbon markets, Marzieh and I's emails are there, and we're happy to answer that to the best of our ability. Thank you.
All right, that does bring us close to our end time for today, and we do want to be timely. We have these webinars scheduled from 12 to 1 each third Wednesday of the month. So we did have one more presentation scheduled for today, but spent just a little more time on carbon credits and carbon markets today, which is okay. We've asked Steve if he will cover his topic next month, which will be our August 17th webinar. And Steve will touch on mobile slaughtering units on our next webinar. And that's kind of a running series that he's been doing where he evaluates different business ideas. So again, we'll try to touch on that next month. We do have a poll question, just like when we started today's webinar. So if you'll indicate following today's presentations, what is your level of knowledge on this topic? But we do want to thank Dr. Smith, Dr. Motallebi, and Lucas for their presentations today. And we, again, our webinar for next month will be August 17th. And if you do have topics or speakers that you think you'd be interested to hear from, please just let us know, and we'll try to follow up and have those in some of our later webinars. If you missed any of the previous webinars, they will be on our Clemson Agribusiness YouTube page, and we try to make announcements through Facebook and things like that as well. But thank you for joining us today, and we will plan to see you next month.